Welcome to the D-Spot podcast. Dr. Dana McNeil is a licensed marriage and family therapist who specializes in working with couples using the Gottman method. Her evidence-based practice provides support for the wide range of relationship issues that modern couples face. By using her open, affirming, and outside-of-the-box thinking, Dr. Dana is able to approach her work with couples by bringing both insights and tools that reflect the realities of today's complicated relationships. Dr. Dana features guests on her podcast that include a unique array of celebrities, CEOs, influencers, and everyday folks who are all working on navigating new conversations about how society views what goes into a successful relationship. And now, here's your host, Dr. Dana McNeil.
Hello, welcome to the D-Spot podcast. I am your host, Dr. Dana McNeil. This is a podcast for all things about relationships and people in them. Today, I am excited to introduce you to somebody that I am a fangirl of, Dr. Kenneth Doka. Hello, how are you?
I'm well, and thank you for inviting me on your podcast. I'm delighted to be here.
You have an enormous resume that I would be reading for like the next half hour, but I'm going to do like a little blurb off the back of my favorite book of yours, which nobody can see because they're not watching this. So Grief is a Journey. It's finding your path through loss. And so here's just a little snippet of your credentials. So you're a licensed mental health counselor and a preeminent expert in grief. You are a professor of gerontology at the Graduate School of the College of New Rochelle, as well as a senior consultant to the Hospice Foundation of America, as well as apparently finding time to be an ordained Lutheran minister. So you speak around the world on dying, death, and bereavement, and your work has been featured in national publications such as Time, Wall Street Journal, Oprah's Spirit Newsletter, CNN, and Nightline. You are a busy beaver. So hi.
I am busy. Let me make a couple of corrections to the biography, because that was a few years old. Now senior vice president of the Hospice Foundation of America.
Of course you are.
Okay. They promoted me once I retired from the college.
Okay.
So I'm Professor Emeritus from the College of New Rochelle.
Great. Well, good. I'm glad you're continuing to do important things and embrace us with the world of grief. How did you get into grief? It's such a heavy topic. What drew you to it?
Well, it was quite by accident. When I was going to seminary, I was also going to graduate school in sociology. And one of the options that I had in seminary was to take a semester off and do a summer, what's called clinical pastoral experience, a CPE, which was an option. I thought that would make my life a little bit easier. And at the time, I was interested in juvenile delinquency.
Okay.
So I had an internship all set and planned, a CPE all set and planned at the Spofford Center in New York. Spofford is where New York City holds its juvenile delinquents. And these are the kids whose crimes are, well, the center is closed now, but in its time, it was usually for kids who crimes were so heinous that they could not be released to the community safely, or their homes were of such disarray.
Yeah. That it wasn't safe to go back to, or
it wasn't safe to go back to. So these were kids who were really on the, you might say the end of a continuum in many ways. And it was for me a fascinating internship and one that I look forward to. And a week before I went, I got a letter from Spofford Center from my supervisor. And I didn't even open it the first day because I just assumed I was in the middle of finals, in the middle of doing all that stuff. And I just assumed
it was a congratulations, we can't wait to see a letter.
Yeah. Bring this and do this and come here. Right. And when I opened the letter, it was devastating. He had switched positions. He was now at the East Midtown Protestant Chaplaincy. I could follow him there, or I could be released from my obligation. Well, my educational program was predicated on doing that CPE that summer, and I would have never gotten another one in a week. So I just figured, well, let me do that. And I kind of consoled myself a little bit. It was very disappointing.
Yeah.
I kind of consoled myself a little bit with, well, you've done some work with children and adolescents. I work with children in a truancy program. Maybe it's give you a good experience with adults and round that out with people, who are older and the like. Of course, when I got there and he saw my prior experience, he put me in the adolescent and pediatric wards. So I was dealing with children and adolescents with cancer.
Oh my Lord.
And that was very difficult. but it really was very illuminating and stimulating in its own way. And I ended up doing 2 master's theses, one for the seminary and one for the graduate school on dying children. And I found myself sort of on the second floor of people who were doing research in the field.
Yeah. So you stuck with it because it had an impact on you.
It had an impact, and you know, and you know, and there was an excitement to being in a new academic field that was just emerging. So I've been in it for about 50 years now.
Wow. It was your calling in a way, sounds like.
It certainly surprised me, but yeah, it really was a calling.
What are some of the, it's just so interesting. None of us ever want to find ourselves in this space of like having to talk about grief or experience grief. And so here you are, you're this safe space for somebody to come and experience positivity and awareness and psychoeducational and coping skills about grief. And how do people approach you? What are those first conversations sound like when they find themselves needing to seek you out?
Well, usually they're talking about some kind of loss that they've had. And so, you know, what I usually do is by starting them and asking them the question, you know, tell me what you're looking for here. And, you know, what are you expecting and what do you want to achieve? Standard therapy. And what's interesting is, and I was just talking about this today in another interview, is that most people will say what they're expected to say. I guess I should bring closure. I guess I should let go. I guess I should move on. And then I'll usually look at them and say, is that what you really want to do? And the answer is not really, you know, and one of the things I've learned over the years, and it's really been established in the literature, it's been a big paradigm shift since I first got in there, is that we never lose the bond with the people we love. We don't talk about that kind of language. I always tell my students, bring closure to closure. You know, we learn to live with our loss. We don't get over it. It's not a cold we get better from. We learn to live with our grief, and most people are reassured because I'll say, you know, it's not that you're going to forget this person. You know, that's not the work that I'm doing with you. You know, I said our first sign of success is when you can laugh at a story about the person without the a story that you can't even consider now because it's just too painful. When you can say, I remember the time he burned the stupid turkey at Thanksgiving, and you can joke about it. And, you know, and I really try to reassure them, it's not about letting go. It's about finding appropriate ways to retain that person and to continue that bond with that person in a way that doesn't impair your growth and your progress. You learn to live with your loss.
You learn to go through it, not get around it or avoid it or.
Yeah. And you learn to carry it with you.
Yeah.
You never lose the connections to the people you love. They're part of your biography. They have your legacies and liabilities. They're part of your memory.
Yeah. Beautiful. Can we talk a little bit about the specific grief that someone experiences when they lose a partner? Is it different from other types of grief?
Well, I think every grief is different from other types of grief. One of the things I say is that grief is as individual as fingerprints. We all have our unique relationship. You know, it's one of the reasons we moved away from stage theories. We no longer, you know, longer look for universal stages, but really try to understand the individual pathways that people are experiencing as they deal with their own loss. You know, one of the things Bowman said in family therapy, for example, is that every sibling grows up in a different home.
Yeah.
That same parents, you know, and I know that's true. There's 13 years difference between my brother and I. And I remember and we really didn't know each other well when we were growing up, because by the time I was 3, he was off to the Navy. And, you know, and so one day we really were together and having a breakfast together without partners, without spouses. And we just had a really good talk. And he was talking about his experiences in the family. And as he was talking, I started laughing. And I said, Frank, do we have the same parents? Is there something, you know, because again, he was growing up with, you know, with teenagers essentially who were trying to raise a child. And I had middle-aged parents who had already raised 2.
So the loss of the parents at the age that they were at when they raised you is what creates the different experience.
Well, they're different experience too. I had an older sister, you know, I mean, like every configuration of family. I don't know, do you have siblings?
I have step siblings, so it's an even different relationship, right?
Yeah. But I'm just saying, but even if you had, you know, full siblings, you would, you know, situations change and experiences change, and you're different.
Yeah.
My brother was argumentative, or I was like, I always remember once I used to go to a boys' club, and I used to hang around a housing project that my father wasn't comfortable with. And my brother was telling me once of an argument that he had with the dad, where they just fought about who he was hanging out with and stuff like that. And, and my approach with my father was very different. He said, I don't want you hanging out there. And I said, Dad, I said it very calmly. I said, we could do this two ways. I can hang out there and lie to you, or we could fight about it. What do you want to do? How do you want to deal with it? And, he just laughed and said, oh, you can't tell you anything. He was more relaxed at that point. I was a better student than my brother, so I think he was more trusting of my judgment. He was more trusting of his judgment, I think.
Sure.
So it's just that we have to realize that even within a family, every relationship is different. And certainly, one of my mentors, Earl Groman, used to say, when you lose a child, it's like you've lost your future. When you lose a parent, it's you've lost your present. You lost your past. When you lose a partner, you lose your present. But the reality is, whenever somebody dies, you lose past, present, and future.
Sure. And I'm imagining that there's different kinds of loneliness that you feel losing a partner than you do losing a parent or something.
But it also depends on the role the partner has in your life. Some people are highly dependent or interdependent with their partners, and some people have relatively independent relationships. Some people, in therapy, some people are more fully differentiated than other people.
Yeah.
So again, we really want to stress the individuality of grief, that that you can't judge your reactions by the reactions of others, because each relationship is different, and we're different, and our cultures are different, and all the circumstances are different.
What is your perspective of how Western culture views grief and loss that's compared to other cultures? Like, is there something unique about us that you don't see in other cultures?
Well, I think one of the big difference is that issue of continuing bonds, that Eastern religions have always emphasized that, that you're part of a long-standing family with ancestors that you are supposed to remember and respect. And actually, Denny Class, who did the original work on that, that's one of the things that influenced him to do research on continuing bonds in the United States. Again, each culture has norms that frame grief, and each culture does it in different ways. So for instance, some cultures are more stoical, and they don't look toward great emotion. I come from a strange cultural background, kind of fun and unique. I always joke that I probably came from the last functional family in America, when you hear people talk, because I think my family was basically pretty functional, but it was half Hispanic and half Hungarian Protestant.
Wow. Okay.
And Hungarian Protestants are known for their stoicism and their, they were a minority in Hungary. They had to be careful of what they said about the most Catholic of emperors.
Right.
So they learned to be very stoic and quiet. And I would joke that even as a kid, I'd go to a family funeral, and my Hispanic uncles would pick me up, and nobody has ever called Hispanic stoic, and at least in my mind. And I'd culturally identify, probably because of my background. As my father said, Hispanics live, used to say of my mother's family, Hispanic families live in tribes rather than family units. And we did. There wasn't a week that went by in my childhood that my mother's relatives weren't collecting together somewhere, play cards, to have a meal together, where my father's relatives were more, holidays we got together. But to make the point I was trying to make is that, when I went to a family funeral, my Hispanic uncles would pick me up and they'd hug me and they'd say, "It's okay to cry, Kenito. It just means you love the person." And then they put me down, and my Hungarian uncles would squeeze my shoulder and say, "Be strong." So,
wow, that's quite the mixed message to get growing up.
Hopefully,
but hopefully you feel like you landed somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I feel it always created interest in different cultures to me.
Yeah. And what I hear you saying is you're normalizing that there isn't a certain way to experience grief or approach grief, that there's a multiple
number of ways.
And you're filtering them all based on your expectations and your family of origin, where you are in life, and who this person was to you, and how connected you were, and what you allow yourself to feel.
Now, obviously, there are more complicated forms that aren't, typical. I mean, people who are self-destructive, who fall into alcoholism or substance abuse, or destructive of others, and of relationships. Some people get so angry they don't want to attach to anybody anymore. And then certainly for some people, grief can be disabling. For
Yes.
some people, it can spark depression or anxiety disorders. So there are a lot of ways you shouldn't grieve.
Yeah.
Or I really shouldn't say you shouldn't grieve, because that's how you grieve, but
Right.
we should get help more
That
immediately.
we worry that it's not necessarily healthy.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to transfer over to one of the most important things that I took away from your book that I want to make sure that we share with everybody is this idea that you write about of disenfranchised grief. So can you talk a little bit about what that is?
Sure. And actually, that's one of the, I think, the things that's incorporated in that book. But for professionals, I actually have 2 books on disenfranchised grief.
Oh, great. We'll have to
focus on therapy.
we'll make sure we put it in the show notes so people
Okay.
can
So
look
one's
for
called Disenfranchised Grief, Recognizing Hidden Sorrow, and the other is called Disenfranchised Grief's Problems, Strategies, Problems, Challenges, and Strategies for Practice. So
Okay.
those are the more professionally oriented books. But what it refers to is when you experience a loss that's not acknowledged by others.
Yeah.
And just to give you a little history of the term, how I got interested in it, I was teaching a course in family, actually, in family therapy. And we were talking about widows, and we were talking about, widows' experience of grief. Wasn't even my grief counseling course. And then one of the women in class said, if you think widows have it tough, you ought to see what happens when your ex-spouse dies. And
Yeah.
I had never, literally, that was like what I call a 2x4 moment. It was like I never honestly ever thought about that.
Yeah.
And I said to the student, Mary Ellen, are you comfortable talking about it? And she was. And she said, my husband and I were married for 25 years, literally planning our silver anniversary cruise. And then I came home from work one day and found him in bed with a neighbor I considered a friend.
Wow.
So huge feelings of betrayal, huge feelings of anger, both. Literally left that day. She threw him out that day. They had a acrimonious divorce, as you can imagine, a lot of conflict, and within 2 years, he had remarried that woman to that woman, moved into her house. She sold her house, moved to another neighborhood.
Yeah.
Very conflicted divorce, and then he died within 2 years, and of pancreatic cancer. And when he died, people would come up to her on the street and say, congratulations, I heard you got him. Good for you.
Oh.
The SOB's dead. And there was part of her, she said, that felt that way.
Yeah.
He got what he deserved. Karma hits her, comes around again. But she said, but the other side of it was, this was the father of my children.
Right.
This was the man I went to the high school prom with. This was the love of my life since I was 15 until that terrible day, and she said, so it was hard for me to even come in touch with my ambivalent feelings. And I couldn't talk about it with anybody because for 2 years, she says, even for the last year, my boyfriend and I, her later fiance and subsequent husband, she said, I was really dealing with trust issues with him. And, and he was so patient and kind. And I kept telling him that my ex really created great issues for me because I loved him and trusted him. And I said, it seemed even hard, as much as I loved him, to turn and say, I really missed him.
Yeah. So ambiguous grief, by your research, is a grief that not everybody experiences. So maybe they don't actually understand it.
Well, I would say I wouldn't use the term ambiguous grief simply because that's part of it. But it's but there's a term out there, and that may be another interview for you with a wonderful therapist,
Pauline Boss.
Pauline Boss. Yeah.
Yes. She is amazing. I like the way that she describes it as like a frozen grief.
Yeah.
Right? That you're sort of held in this space and there's not a way to move forward.
Yeah, she's a dear colleague, and we've been together on different kinds of things. But what disenfranchised means is that others don't acknowledge your loss. Sometimes because ultimately it's not socially sanctioned, it's not openly acknowledged, it's not publicly mourned. So you have a loss, but nobody knows, maybe nobody knows about it. Sometimes we disenfranchise our own grief. but it can involve a lot of situations. One is where the relationship isn't recognized, like an ex-spouse or an extramarital affair.
Like you're saying, the example, she had multiple layers of sources of this disenfranchised grief, right? The affair, the
Yeah.
loss of the ex, the having to like feel okay with having thoughts of revenge or wanting something bad to happen.
Sure. Yeah. So often ambiguity is part of it, and ambivalent feelings are part of it. I do want to differentiate from Pauline Boss's wonderful concept.
Right.
And then in other cases where the loss isn't acknowledged, like sometimes the loss of an animal companion, which can be very profound for some people, especially older people living alone, where the animal plays so many roles in their lives, or perinatal loss, or a divorce.
I'm imagining when you have a partner that's incarcerated, that's also
Very much so. Yeah.
Right.
And not just for that, for the family. One of my cases was a 9-year-old boy whose stepfather, but pretty much the only father he grew up with, his father died when he was 4. And probably this other man moved in when he was about 5.5, 6. But for 3 years, this had been this boy's father, and he loved him. And he was arrested for a crime that had been committed a number of years before. And this kid, the only place he could talk about the fact, because in the neighborhood, the story was, it was a middle-class child. It was a middle-class neighborhood. And the story that was going around was that, he was working in Alaska or something like that.
So we make excuses for why the person can't be there, because sharing our grief won't necessarily get us any acknowledgement or create shame.
Exactly. So, it was a family secret. So he could discuss it with himself, with his grandmother, with his mom, with his grandmother, and with me.
So this idea of disenfranchised grief is, I can't necessarily feel comfortable sharing it with others because number one, I don't think they're going to understand it. Number two, they might slightly have an attitude or be a little judgy about it. Or they don't think that I should feel that way. So because they can't validate it, they're not able to have empathy for it.
Exactly. And then there are other, situations. Another situation is where the griever isn't acknowledged. Somebody with developmental disabilities, somebody with dementia. They may not show the loss in the same way, but they may experience it. And then, of course, the ways people grieve. And then some losses are stigmatized, like drug deaths.
Yeah.
Or even doesn't have to even be that. What if I told you a friend of mine died of COVID? What's the first thing you're likely to say to me?
How old were they?
And maybe, was he vaccinated?
Oh, sure. There's all kinds of layers of judginess, right? Or I'm imagining, to make it worse, well, if they were in their 80s, they left a good life, so you should.
Yeah, we often disenfranchise the deaths of the very old.
Yeah. So since I'm imagining there's not a lot of support groups, and maybe their therapist isn't well versed in disenfranchised grief, what's the first step to someone starting to process that? How do they manage it?
I think to just validate it, to recognize, this is a relationship I have. This is an attachment I have. Doesn't even have to be a relationship. This is an attachment I have, and that attachment now has been severed. And it's natural when we love something and it's taken from us that we're going to grieve.
Is there ways that you would encourage those that are experiencing that? Because here's what I imagine is, I have this thing and I said what you just said, which is beautifully said, right? I'm in pain. And people start to back away, not because they don't care about you, but because they don't know what to do with it. It doesn't make sense in their vocabulary. Is there something that you could tell people who care about you that would help them give you the support that you need?
Yeah, just be supportive. Just listen. You don't need to say anything. Just listen. Just try to understand my loss. As I talk about it, it helps me.
Yeah.
And if you can be, I used to call it, I still call it the ministry of presence. Sometimes we just don't have to be, when I first started working at Sloan Kettering, I insisted on getting one adult floor. And, because I didn't want to, I figured that was one thing that could add to me, was an experience of dealing with adults. And I'll never forget one time I felt so powerless. I walked into a room, a woman had just had an operation for cancer. It was one of those where they opened her up and immediately closed her up. The cancer was too widespread. And I hate this phrase, there was nothing more to do. There's always something more to do, even if it's the palliation of pain. There's always something we can offer. And that's how I often train physicians, although I think that's more and more common among physicians, that they avoid that language. But in any case, here I am, 23 years old. I'm a student, don't have much experience. And this woman sitting by the window, tears just streaming down her eyes. I don't know what to say. And I just took her hand and patted it and trying to find some words, which I never could find. And I sat there for a half hour. And then she kind of nodded, and I kind of nodded and left. And I felt, boy, I really sucked at that one. That was terrible. And then she died a few weeks later. And her daughter actually came back to the hospital to see me. And she said, my mother never forgot the comfort you gave her.
Ah.
And I thought, are you kidding? I was the most uncomfortable person there because I didn't know what to say or what to do. But, sometimes just our presence, our listening can be the best gift we can give. There are no words to make death and grief better.
Yeah.
Nothing you can say.
You didn't shy away from it. You ddidn't tell her it was too much. You didn't suggest she put it away or that she minimize it because it was making you uncomfortable, which so many.
Exactly. I didn't say, well, look at you, have a few weeks. What do you want to do left? Let's have a party,
or everything happens for a reason and you just don't know it yet. You're being chosen to learn how to be strong or something that doesn't feel helpful.
Yeah. So I think just, so I learned a great deal then that sometimes it's just our presence that is so therapeutic.
I'm grateful to hear you say this because I'm imagining anyone who's listening to this who is experiencing a friend, a colleague, a partner that's experiencing grief, that you've just given them a nice gift that they don't have to say the perfect thing or have the perfect thing to do, or God forbid, fix someone's feelings. That presence of, I may not know what to say, but you're not going through this alone is such a lovely
I'm here
gift.
for you. Yeah. And I always tell people, the less you open your mouth, the less likely you are going to say something that they're going to remember as being destructive, or stupid,
Because we do get overwhelmed, or we physiologically overwhelmed.
There's a wonderful little book that I sometimes use with people, or I use the strategy in the book. I think it's out of print now. It's just a tiny little book by Erin Lynn, and it's called I Know Just How You Feel, Avoiding the Cliches of Grief.
Oh, wow. That's great. I want to find that and put it in the show notes.
I don't know if she's even alive because it was many years ago that she wrote that. And I haven't seen her at an association meeting in a long time. But she does three things. She takes the comment, these comments that people give, says, well, why did it hurt? And usually it hurts because it invalidates your loss. Well, at least your child died, but you at least have 3 other children.
Oy.
Yeah. And people say those things, or, you're young, you can get married again, or these things that people say to, try. And then she says, well, why did people say it? And the reality is most of the time, people are not trying to be cruel.
Yeah.
They just don't know what. So she validates that. And then she says, and you may never get the chance to say it, but what could you say in response? And, and the response could be, I don't know what my future is, and I don't know if I'm getting married or not, but I'll never marry another Mary. I'll never marry another Lucy. That relationship was unique, or, it's a comfort to have 3 children, but Paul died, and each of my children is unique and special in their own way, and he was. So by giving you those responses, it's empowering, even if you never get to use them.
Wow. This is incredible. I'm so grateful that you were willing to give me some time and give this invaluable tip and support and kind of normalize for a lot of us this concept. You've now given a word to a concept that people are experiencing and they don't know what it is, and they feel lost. And so thank you for that. Any last tips for anybody who might be listening?
No, it's just thank you for having me on, and I look forward to hearing your podcast, and I'll follow you from now on. See some.
You're delightful. So tell everybody how to get in touch with you if they want to reach out to you or hopefully buy your book, because your book is amazing. All your books are amazing.
Well, thank you very much. And I have a webpage, Dr. Ken Doka, one word, drkendoka.com, and they could find information there and find contact information there.
Perfect. This has been a big honor. I am a fan of yours. So this is really.
I'm honored to be on. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Take care.
Take care.
This has been the D-Spot podcast with Dr. Dana McNeil. To learn more about Dr. Dana's practice, simply visit us at www.danamcneil.com.